We want today to take up Kant's ethics. And let me start by reminding you that at the end of the critique of practical reason, at the end of his first critique, he points out that even though in terms of what he calls doctrinal belief, what we can know metaphysically, rationally, we cannot demonstrate the existence of God, yet it may be possible on the basis of ethics to affirm rationally the existence of God. So there's a natural transition between the first critique on pure reason and the second critique on practical reason. It's sometimes said that the first critique is dealing with our faculty of knowing, the second critique with our faculty of willing, and the third critique of judgment, with the faculty of feeling. All right, maybe, but in any case, it's in the second critique that you get the notion of the moral will introduced, and moral responsibility, moral duty, and so forth. Now, a few preliminaries. One is this comment that by anybody's reading, Kant is a moral realist. That is to say, he insists that there are objective moral truths about objective moral qualities, that there are objectively real moral distinctives between right and wrong, between virtue and vice. He's a moral realist, in that sense, an objectivist. And his famous categorical imperative, which we'll be looking at, tells us how we can know that difference between right and wrong. Now, his moral realism is, however, very much in keeping with the concerns of others in the late 18th century. There's a sense in which the 18th century could be described as an age of moral crisis, because the aftermath of the scientific revolution, the Copernican revolution in physics, was, of course, a turn to a mechanistic science, without teleology, therefore without the conception of the good as an all-inclusive ideal which everything in nature strives to imitate. The result was that right after the scientific revolution and during it, there was a groping for some new way of addressing ethical questions. And we saw in Bacon, and it's true in Descartes as well, a kind of early version of utilitarianism in terms of what works. There was a sophisticated development in Thomas Hobbes, whom the 18th century saw as an unqualified hedonist, a thoroughgoing determinist, without recognizing a shred of human goodwill, benevolence. That was the 18th century reading of Hobbes. And when we were talking about him, I think I pointed out that it doesn't really come out that way. There are notes of benevolence in his concern, and so forth. The 18th century also called him a thoroughgoing atheist, and that's not the case clearly at all. But in any case, that reading of Hobbes precipitated a great deal of concern among 18th century philosophers for providing some objective grounding of morals, a concern about moral realism, you see. One of the moves in that direction was the Cambridge Platonism, you remember. Another, you might say, is John Locke's attempt to ground natural law, human law, in the rational nature of human beings. Some reading I was doing just this morning, I discovered that Locke was very close to the daughter of Ralph Cudworth, who was really the leading Cambridge Platonist, you see. And Locke's rejection of innate ideas may well have been a rejection, as we mentioned before, of the Cambridge Platonism. But at the same time, he shared their concern for an objective grounding of ethics. The same was the concern of those moral sense philosophers, people like Butler, Adam Smith, Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, that we noted more in passing than anything else. And that Shaftesbury was the son of a family where Locke was hired as a tutor, so he was a tutor to the Shaftesbury who later developed moral sense philosophy. That Shaftesbury rejected Locke's approach to ethics and wanted to have something much more definite, and so the development of that notion of a moral sense. David Hume, it's said, was very much influenced by the moral sense thinkers. In fact, there is an interpretation, a fairly recent interpretation that's been developed in the last 10 years or so, that David Hume was so much influenced by the moral sense philosophers that he too shared their concern about ethical realism. Now, when we were talking about him, I suggested that he was an ethical subjectivist. That is to say something is right or wrong is simply to refer to how people feel about it. But according to this newer interpretation, those moral feelings, moral sentiments, are simply signs by which we recognize what is objectively the way it is. The case for that interpretation of Hume really hinges on some statements that Hume seems to make about the difference between virtue and vice, which sound as if he's talking about objective qualities of individuals, of human beings. So that if virtue and vice are objective qualities, then there is an objective difference between those qualities, and you've got moral objectivity, at least in the status of the moral qualities. So this matter of moral realism was very much a concern of 18th century thinkers. Likewise of Immanuel Kant, very much a moral realist, trying to avoid some of the possible ethical implications of that mechanistic science with its causal determinism, which of course would take away from individual moral responsibility, and its implicit subjectivist implications. So it's with that in mind then that Kant writes about ethics. Now, his approach to ethics is remarkably like his approach to metaphysics. There, in examining the faculty of knowing, what he looks for is the a priori structures, the subjective structures that shape the way in which we think and understand. as well as perceive things. In the critique of practical reason, he's again looking for the mental structures, the subjective structures or principles that we bring to our moral thinking. And again, the question is whether those structures of our thought are purely subjective, as was the case with the forms and categories, or whether they have any objective correlates. So that when it turns out that the subjective structure involves some sense of duty, of respect for moral law, the question is whether there is any objective moral law, you see. And while he concludes that the forms and categories used in science and metaphysics are purely subjective, it turns out that the categories used in ethics are objective. That is to say, there are objective correlates. There is such a thing as objective moral duty. There's an objective difference between right and wrong, objective moral law. So he is, in those regards, a moral realist. Now, in order to see the way he does that, you have to recognize then that he is again seeing the synthetic a priori nature of ethical judgments. So that the ethical judgment, then, involves the confluence of two kinds of input. On the one hand, empirical input, and on the other hand, some a priori principle. So that when we say stealing is wrong, you get an empirical description of an act that is known as stealing, and you get the concept of wrong or lack of rightness as the a priori principle. So that what you get then is the introduction of an a priori principle in our moral reflection, in our moral awareness, an a priori principle that is applied to factual situations. Applied to, not implied in, but applied to factual situations. This a priori principle is, of course, the categorical imperative. Now, you have an initial selection about this in the anthology. The last little piece of Kant in the anthology. The last piece in the anthology, period. And that is taken not from the critique of practical reason, but from his metaphysical foundations of morals. Some of you may have read that material in your introductory course, and recall that what he does is to start by saying that there is only one thing that is unconditionally good. That is to say, a good will. Good will. The focus is on intention, on motive, on character, the inner disposition of the individual. And it's only the goodness of that inner moral disposition that can be regarded as good without qualification. After all, our natural inclinations can be twisted, diverted, perverted. Our desires may be self-indulgent, you see. So that our desire for happiness is not something that is in itself good and right. It can be misdirected. So he makes a clear distinction between, on the one hand, inclinations, because inclinations are towards empirical objects. Okay? A clear distinction between inclinations, on the one hand, and the sense of duty, on the other hand. The sense of duty is referring back to the a priori principle. The inclinations are looking forward to empirical satisfactions. And the moral quality is involved in the former. He makes the distinction another way, by talking about hypothetical imperatives as distinct from categorical imperatives. Well, you know the difference between a hypothetical proposition and a categorical proposition. A hypothetical one is if. If you want this, then do that. It would be a sort of a hypothetical moral structure. If you want this, then do that. So that hypothetical imperatives are oriented to ends, outcomes, consequences, inclinations, desires, okay? And they're not unqualifiedly good. On the other hand, categorical imperatives are not iffy at all, you see. Without qualification, categorical imperative tells you what's right. So while he starts by saying the only unconditionally good thing is acting out of a sense of will, he develops that notion of the completely unconditional imperative. It's goodwill, yes, to act out of respect for duty, not just in accordance with duty. Kant's not saying do your duty. Well, not saying just that, because he knows perfectly well that you can do your duty for the wrong reason. Like you can observe the speed limit because there's a cop car following. No moral virtue in that, you see. But doing one's duty out of respect for duty is the sort of thing that he's after. Then he goes on to develop that more fully. Going that far alone, he calls common sense morality. Because it is, in effect, the kind of common morality which many ordinary people in the street would immediately describe. But he goes on to develop it in his more philosophical way, in trying to articulate his categorical imperative, which he presents in three forms. One is often referred to as the universalizability principle. The second is referred to nowadays as the principle of respect for persons. And the third as the autonomy of the will, the autonomous will. A word about each of these. Universalizability. That you should always act according to a maxim. A maxim is a moral rule. According to a maxim that you could will as universal moral law. Always act according to a maxim that you could will as a universal moral law. And two interpretations of that have developed. One is would it be something which you could get enacted? And that is to say that all persons would recognize as morally binding. Universalism. The other, more usual interpretation, is that is it logically possible to will that? Now, something that's not logically possible to will would be a self-contradiction. So if you cannot logically will it to be a universal moral law, it's because it would turn out to be a self-contradictory law, a self-defeating thing. If, for instance, you're trying to take a loan and promise to, with a promise to repay it by a certain date, knowing and intending fully well not to repay it, you are in a with no intention to keep the promise. Now, the maxim on which you're acting, if universalized, would be something like, everybody could, if they wished, make promises without doing in two senses. One, you're really not making a promise. You're making a promise which is not a promise. The second, you're just the whole institution of promising by the universal law. There would be no such thing as promise. So it would be a contradictory law. So the categorical imperative then stated in that way. The problem with that formulation is that it provides a negative criterion telling you what you cannot do, rather than a positive criterion. A negative criterion rather than a positive criterion. Now, Kant, however, goes on to a second formulation that nowadays gets known as respect for persons. His way of putting it is that we should always, there's the universalizability carried over into this, we should always treat persons as ends in themselves, rather than as means only. Never treat a person only as a means, always as an end. Now, he's not saying never treat persons as means. We do that all the time. You're using me right now to get some credit, and I'm using you to earn a living. Yeah, he's not saying that's wrong. But he is saying that in the ways in which we use people, treat those people as a value in themselves. And why that? Well, because they're rational people with moral will as you. So it's really universalizing what I ask for myself, that I be respected as a rational being, able to make moral decisions. Universalizing that in a Now, that emphasis on respect for persons has been made a great deal of use of in, for instance, contemporary medical ethics and business ethics. It's been developed at the University of Chicago, that's still around, had a principle like this, when he says that if I ask respect for my life project, then consistency requires that I respect your life project. Why do I ask respect for mine? Because I'm a rational, self-determining being. You see. So he argues for a principle of generic consistency, as he calls it, a principle of generic consistency, PGC, it gets known. And this is really the universalization of respect for persons. So that's the second way of stating the categorical imperative, and obviously it has much more positive application. Now, it seems to me that one of the difficulties with this is that what it means to respect a person really depends on how you define a person. And if you're not satisfied with the sufficiency of defining a person simply as a rational being, but if there is more to the notion of personhood, then that needs to be spelled out. And I'm inclined to argue there is more to it. Therefore, this is an incomplete ethic. The third version of the categorical imperative involves his distinction between the autonomous will and, on the other hand, the heteronymous will. Now, a heteronymous will is one that is ruled by another. Heteronomy, governed by another. Autonomy means, of course, self-government. The autonomous will is one that is self-governed. His point, basically, is that the categorical imperative requires that you act out of your own good will. You see, it's coming back to that notion. That it be a free act, self-determined, acting of your own will, rather than being governed, driven by other people's desires and expectations, going along with the crowd, conforming to social pressures, following your own desires rather than acting out of free will, enslaved by your own inclinations. So that's the basic distinction. Not surprising what he's been criticized here, really,